Without further ado, clinical trial patient matching with large language models. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? And why does it matter? Just as a little bit of background, as Albert mentioned, I'm a PhD student at Stanford right now in computer science. I'm co-advised by Nigam Shah and Chris Ray, and research-wise, have just been interested in thinking about evaluations and developing models for clinical applications to improve hospital operations, and clinical trial patient matching is one of those examples. So what is kind of the main question that we looked at in this research? Basically, can we accelerate patient recruitment for clinical trials? And if folks just kind of want to skip to the punchline, I added this link here with the paper and some of the write-up that we did afterwards as well at clinicaltrialmatch.stanford.edu. But taking a step back, why is this even a question that we might care about? Why do we want to accelerate patient recruitment for clinical trials? Finding patients to enroll is one of the key unsolved bottlenecks in bringing new drugs to market. So some crazy statistics when I first started looking into this, something like 1 in 3 trials ends up getting terminated simply because they can't find enough patients to enroll. So nothing to do with the efficacy or safety or whatever of the actual drug itself, but purely an operational failure. And even trials that aren't terminated due to lack of enrollment, almost all of them end up seeing some sort of delay due to slow recruitment of patients. And so being able to accelerate this process can not only help more trials finish, but also help the trials that do finish faster. And then in terms of the actual financial impact, if you look at the breakdown of costs of running a clinical trial, almost a third of the cost of running a trial ends up going towards recruitment and enrollment. And so not only is there a huge burden in terms of bringing new drugs to market and providing access to therapies for patients, but also there's a big financial incentive for pharmaceutical companies to accelerate this process. And so why is finding patients so hard today? Well, if you look at how it's done today, it becomes immediately obvious. And so the typical way that we find patients is very manual. Typically involves a person called a clinical research coordinator who's trained in the trial that they're supervising and has some clinical expertise. And what happens at an academic medical center like Stanford is you'll hire an army of clinical research coordinators. You will give them the protocol of the trial that you're trying to recruit for, and this can be 100+ page document with dozens of eligibility criteria. And these eligibility criteria are fairly complex. They require temporal reasoning. There's a lot of conditioning within them. They're very specific. There's a lot of clinical jargon, and so it's not trivial to structure these things and just run a SQL query over your database. And all of these criteria as provided by the pharmaceutical company are specified as free text. So it's not even, in structured form. And then on the flip side, you have, okay, I have my trial protocol with a bunch of eligibility criteria. I need to find patients who meet all those eligibility criteria. How am I going to find those patients? Well, you go to the EHR database of your hospital, and the majority of relevant information, something like 80%, is not stored in structured information, but again, is stored as unstructured free text. And so what you do is you have these clinical research coordinators literally going patient by patient, one at a time, scrolling through, dozens, if not hundreds of clinical notes per patient, and basically trying to find out, okay, with this checklist of, 50 criteria, does the patient meet or not meet every single one of these criteria? And so it's no surprise that, when you have to review potentially thousands of records for some of these more specific trials that might be targeting a specific cancer subtype or, a rare disease, it ends up taking months, if not potentially a year or more, to end up finding enough patients to hit your enrollment targets. And so, there's been a lot of attempts to solve this problem before large language models. There have been rule-based systems. There's been, I'd call this like traditional NLP systems. And then there have been, end-to-end deep learning systems. But all of this was kind of before the advent of large language models, which, as I'm sure we're all well familiar with, are very well suited for processing unstructured text. And so all of these systems kind of suffered from some sort of limitation that limited their practical applicability, even though they did make great strides forward from where we were previously. And so, going back to the original question, if our goal is to speed up patient recruitment by trying to automate this screening process, why not do it with LLMs? It's 2025. That's kind of the direction most people are heading. And so to kind of set up the generic task here, right? We'll have on the left-hand side the patient's EHR, basically just, notes extracted from their health record. On the right-hand side, we'll have some sort of inclusion criteria specified as free text. And then we'll basically ask the language model, hey, does this patient meet this criteria, yes or no? And the nice thing is, because all of this is text, we can feed it through a language model and have it output text. And so, we're working within the modality that it's been trained on and that it's well equipped to handle. And so that's why large language models are a pretty obvious application to this problem, and potentially a high impact application. And so what do we do in this paper specifically? I guess the details aren't super important, but basically we set up this retrieval system where we try to retrieve relevant parts from the patient's note that are relevant to a specific criteria, and then we feed it through a large language model. We don't label any data. And so that's what we mean by zero shot, that there's zero examples that the model is looking at. And so it's basically just what is the out of the box performance of these large language models. And then at the end of it, we have the model output, hey, I think this patient is eligible, yes or no. And then also provide some sort of explanation of, hey, this is why I think they're eligible or not. And here's some evidence from the clinical note that you can reference. And so, to cut to the chase, our findings were pretty strong in that these language models can pretty accurately do this task in a zero-shot fashion today. And I'm sure Jifeng will expand on this as well with their findings, which corroborated this. And so if you look at the benchmark that we were looking at, it was a 2018 N2C2 clinical trial matching benchmark. There was a prior, state-of-the-art model, which basically had a bunch of hand-engineered features by domain experts looking for specific criteria in notes. And so, you can see the metrics here. Higher numbers are better. Again, the prior state-of-the-art required a clinical expert to literally go in and write, hundreds of rules for each criteria. And then the rest of these results here are a number of different large language models. The one I highlight at the bottom here is the best performing one, which is GPT-4, which is provided by OpenAI. And you can see here that pretty consistently across the board, not only is it better than the prior state of the art, but the overall accuracy numbers are fairly high. And the key takeaway here is not only are these numbers better or comparable, but you do it with no labeled data. And so, one of the pains that a lot of people fret about in, the machine learning for healthcare world is it's expensive to label data. I have to have a doctor. It costs a lot of money. It's time consuming to label data. Well, the great thing about these large language models is they've been pre-trained on so much data, and they have such strong out of the box capabilities. This didn't even require us to label any data. So this is purely out of the box. And so with this kind of zero shot approach, you can avoid a lot of the headache that traditional ML for healthcare had, which was, oh, you need to label data first to train your model. This requires nothing like that. And so this allows an approach like this to instantly scale to other trials, other eligibility criteria, other patients, because you simply just swap in the text that represents the task that you care about. And to kind of, take a step back, accuracy is great, but what about the cost, the time to do this, et cetera? What about the deployment considerations that you might care about if you're a hospital? Well, across the board, as you can imagine, having a machine do this task is much faster and cheaper than, having a trained coordinator do this task, right? And so here are some numbers. This was pulled from a phase 3 cancer trial. On average, it took a coordinator about an hour to screen a patient, and roughly the amortized cost was $35 per patient screened. If you just extrapolate from the numbers from our study, it cost us roughly a nickel for every patient that we screen, and a number of seconds, right? And so huge dramatic cost and efficiency savings by switching to this language model. Now you might be wondering, am I just going to trust a language model to enroll patients in trials? That seems like that's a very fraught area. And so that's why I want to highlight this last row and get into the last part of our results in the last couple minutes of how do we think about human AI collaboration here, right? Because you're never just going to deploy a model and just have it, enroll patients. You always have some sort of human review. And so a question that we were trying to explore is, okay, how do we make the outputs of this language model explainable and interpretable for a human to review? And so that's kind of what this last row is, why we gave the language model a check here as well. And so this gets back to the previous thing I had mentioned about having the language model output not just, hey, this patient matches this trial, yes or no, but also an explanation rationalizing its decision. And so what we did was we took all the explanations generated by the model, and we asked Stanford clinicians to basically evaluate, hey, does this explanation, is it clinically justified or is it not? And so for the decisions, the eligibility decisions that the language model got correct, so it said a patient was eligible and the patient was actually eligible, almost all of the explanations were clinically justified according to the review that we did manually with clinicians. The surprising part, and what I think is much more interesting though, is if you look at the eligibility decisions that GPT-4 got quote unquote wrong, in other words, our benchmark data sets label disagreed with GPT-4's decision. Actually, Stanford clinicians agreed with GPT-4 three-quarters of the time over the original benchmarks label. And so what this means is, a couple things like one, we may be underestimating the capabilities of these language models because our own labels for this data aren't perfect. But two, there are a lot of areas in clinical decision making where the reasoning process isn't binary 0 or 1, it's fuzzy, right? Like I can give you a patient and I can say, hey, does this patient have a serious event for, condition X? And two clinicians might disagree reasonably on what severe entails. And so just outputting, binary yes, no, this patient's eligible or not, might not be, even the desired output that we want from these models or from a coordinator. Instead, we want some sort of, hey, this patient might be eligible, because they have this condition and this condition, but if your a definition of severe is this bar, then maybe they're not, right? And so the nice thing about these language models is because they can output natural language, they are able to better capture that sort of fuzzy gray area that is endemic to a lot of clinical judgments. And so with that, I'll conclude by just wanting to thank my collaborators. A lot of folks contributed to this project. And then if people are interested in looking at the paper or some more results, they can be found at the link here in the QR code as well. So appreciate the time and looking forward to the panel discussion.